The Dungarvon Whooper is one of the Maritimes' most famous ghost stories. About 2 years ago, we did an episode which made the case that the ghost story, which is still often told around Maritimes campfires today, was actually created by a Boston newspaper some 30 years after the events of the Dungarvon Whooper. There had, however, actually been a strange set of blood-curdling screams and an even stranger set of mysterious encounters deep in the woods of northern New Brunswick. In that earlier episode, we met 2 reporters, one from New Brunswick and one from Washington, D.C., who were camping along the Dungarvon River when they were awakened by the telltale blood-curdling screams to find not a ghost but a distinctly human, eccentric man living in the woods. Which actually, in many ways, is much scarier. I mean, we're talking about a man with a rusty axe walking around barefoot in winter, like, jeez, give me the ghost any day. That story was based on what one of 2 reporters, Frank Christine, who was a New Brunswicker, later wrote, which included the memorable lines.
Who is this hermit? What was the secret of his tortured mind? How long had he endured the solitude of the forest without weapon, fire, or proper food? How had he survived the rigor of northern winters without proper clothing or shelter?
As far as I was aware, the American reporter who had accompanied him had never written about that meeting with the Dungarvon Whooper. However, completely out of the blue, I recently received an email from a Moncton photographer named Perry Brewer. He had been reading through old sports magazines from the 1890s looking for photographs of a caribou when he stumbled across an article written by that American reporter recounting in detail the events of that trip to Dungarvon and his meeting with what he called
the Lost Man.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
In looking over a collection of photographs taken last summer while on a New Brunswick fishing trip, I have come upon one that revives queer memories. Readers may puzzle over the matter as I have done,
wrote Frederick Erland in Forest and Stream magazine in 1895. Frederick Erland didn't normally write about events in the backwoods of New Brunswick. He actually usually wrote about pretty much the complete opposite. He worked in the American Congress, covering political matters in Washington, D.C. He was deep in the woods of New Brunswick because he had been invited there by Frank Christine, a Fredericton reporter who worked in the legislature. Frank Christine has been described as the father of New Brunswick tourism for his tireless efforts to promote the province. That wasn't his job. He wasn't even paid to do this tourism promotion stuff. It was more like a somewhat unusual hobby. Kind of a statement on the quality of New Brunswick tourism promotion, really. In a major coup, though, this amateur tourism promotion hobbyist had convinced the high-profile American reporter Frederick Erland to come to New Brunswick to go fishing with him in the Miramichi. The plan was that the American would then write up a series of glossy stories for as many American readers to promote Frank Christine's beloved province. However, as Frederick Erland wrote in his article, the trip would take an unusual turn.
The thing happened in a corner of the wide, little-known wilderness which forms the larger part of the province of New Brunswick. Under the pilotage of that greatest of all New Brunswick guides, Mr. Henry Braithwaite of Stanley, 3 of us had started from Boys Town on our way to Little Sow-West Lake, a good 60-mile walk. It was wilderness so little disturbed that we knew the pedigree of every footprint we saw.
There were only 2 other sets of human footprints in the woods, as far as they knew. Those belonged to the 2 assistants who worked for their guide, Henry Braithwaite, and they'd gone ahead to mark the trail. One assistant guide was a local man named Dave Douglas, while the other was an unnamed Mi'kmaq guide from the Gaspé Peninsula region in Quebec. The main group, including the 2 reporters, traveled mostly by canoe, except for the dreaded Dungarvon portage, where they would have to carry their equipment over some particularly rough terrain.
Some of you know what a 30-mile portage is, over a very old and long unused lumber road, full of fallen trees, up steep hillsides, across quaking bogs, where the horses frequently break through leg deep.
They arrived at a long-abandoned logging camp, where lumberjacks would have once spent the winter cutting trees.
There the trail ended entirely, at an old lumber camp, the last purpose of even that barbaric relative of civilization. Beyond stretched the grim and unmapped wilderness.
Waiting for them was Dave Douglas, who was one of the 2 advance guides. The other guide, the unnamed Mi'kmaq guide from Quebec, was some 12 miles further ahead, building a birch bark canoe that the group would use to cross the next river. Settling into their abandoned logging camp, the group caught some trout for dinner, while their guide, Henry Brathwaite, managed to catch a 7-pound salmon, and he cooked them dinner as the night began to fall.
The day died slowly, as it always does in July. It was nearly 9 o'clock before it got too dark to read.
The tired American reporter thought it was too dark to hunt in the evening, but the New Brunswick reporter, Frank Christine, disagreed, and to prove his point, Frederick Erland wrote that he
fired at a distant stub and hit it.
They trudged out to hunt, but quickly had to abandon this plan as the night began to fall. They returned to the deserting logging camp, where
we turned in as soon as it was dark, occupying the long deserted bunks of the lumbermen of other days. The fire outside flickered and fizzled, and 2 minutes after I lay down, I fell asleep.
Although it was the height of summer, it was an unusually cold night, so they lit a fire in an old stove in their dilapidated cabin. They were awoken in the night by a high-pitched scream in the cold darkness. Shaken, the men were unable to fall back to sleep. As they lay awake, they saw a shadowy silhouette darken the open doorway of their cabin. One of the men struggled to light a candle, and in the flickering flame's light, they saw an old man wearing tattered rags with long disheveled matted hair standing in their doorway. He was carrying an old rusty axe, although from the way he behaved, he didn't seem to be an immediate threat. The old man tiredly walked past them, up to their dying fire, and began warming his hands over its embers. In Frederick Erland's article about these events, he recounted that he had actually slept through all of this late-night excitement, despite Frank Christine trying to wake him up, writing,
"Sometime in the night, I do not know when, it was after the moon rose, I was awakened by Christine, who crept back into the bunk saying that a lost man had come into camp, and that neither the men nor himself could make anything out of him. I was too sleepy to take much interest in the matter."
The tale of the Dungarvon Whooper had begun 25 years before, when the worst storm in the Maritimes history, called the Saxby Gale, which oddly enough was predicted a full year before it hit, ripped through the region way back in 1869. There's an episode of the Backyard History podcast which covers that story in detail. A rather unusual side effect, though, was that, shortly after the storm subsided, strange screams began to be heard in the forests of northern New Brunswick. People described them as sounding like whooping. In the 5 years that followed the Saxby Gale ripping through the region, the whoops could come quite close to the logging camps in the area. It was said that their presence scared the horses and even the tough lumberjacks who worked there. People living in the area guessed that the unusual noises were some kind of weird animal, although nobody could pinpoint exactly what would make a blood-curdling scream. One popular suggestion, though, was that it was an eastern panther, another creature which, by the way, nobody seems quite sure whether it's real or not. The lair of whatever creature this was said to be the caves at the head of Clearwater Brook. After 5 years of this, a particularly bad spring flooded the caves, and the sound suddenly stopped. 15 years passed quietly, when suddenly, the whooper reappeared. It was the autumn of 1889 when the blood-curdling screams began to be heard once again, echoing through the northern forests of New Brunswick. Although the old-timers claimed that the screams were the same, the location was different. Now they were around the Dungarvon, which was a stream in southwest Miramichi. Although the haunting screams were the same, the behavior was much different and far more brazen. The Whooper was now breaking into logging camps and cabins when people were away and making off with flour, salt cod, and pork. These are not the kind of things that eastern panthers tend to pull off. Particularly frustrating for the loggers was that the Whooper was targeting their depot camps, where they spent the summer stocking up on foods for their winter logging seasons. Fear of the mysterious Whooper and its ghostly howls spread, and people living in the area became afraid to go out at night. By the time the two reporters arrived in the area, the mysterious Dungarvon Whooper had been back for 5 years, and the general consensus by then was that the strange sounds were coming not from a ghost, or even from an eastern panther, but from a human being. You can check out the Backyard History podcast's other earlier Dungarvon Whooper episode to hear about a few people's close encounters that really point to this creature being human. Personally, I'm firmly of the opinion that the Dungarvon Whooper and the lost man that Frederick Erlin spoke to the following day are the same person. In Frederick Erlin's article, he gives us our first detailed description of the Dungarvon Whooper.
The next morning, I discovered in the camp a grizzled, skinny old chap who might have been 70 and was more likely 60. He had 2 weeks' growth of beard. He was tall and bony and strong considering his age. He had refused to come into the camp the night before, but slept all night on the ground by the fire. He had with him no matches, no compass, no blanket, and no food. His sole earthly possession was a rusty axe which he had picked up in some stream that he crossed, and it was plain to see that it had lain in the water a long time. The vast tract of mountain and forest is an extremely bad place for a man who has neither food nor fire. Yet, the fact of being far astray in an absolutely unpopulated wilderness did not arouse a word of alarm or regret. He spoke with an uncertainty of utterance which made him difficult to pronounce intelligibly.
Despite the stranger being difficult to understand, Frederick Erlin tried to interview his unexpected guest. He wrote this in a honestly somewhat confusingly worded part of his article, in which he seems to record his questions to the Whooper, his opinions on the matter, and his surprise in just one conversation, in which he avoids directly quoting the man. We're going to present this to you just as it appeared in his article.
How had he stumbled upon us? Oh, he heard the gun go off. Where was he going? To Grand Falls? And he thought he was almost there? But great goodness, man, Grand Falls is on the St. John River, 70 miles in a straight line and 100 from here the way you'll have to go. This information did not seem to disturb the man much, and in fact nothing else did. What had he had to eat yesterday? A quail? Now there is not a quail in that region. How long had he been out? He did not remember, but he had been in the American War. If he could get to Grand Rapids, he had friends there. It was difficult for him to pronounce his own name intelligibly, but it sounded like Dorns or Torrance. While breakfast was being cooked, I took his photograph, a thing he did not like. Our guide, Mr. Braithwaite, said, "Well, I've been in these woods most of my life, and he beats me."
So, assuming the lost man was indeed the Dungarvon Whooper, which I believe he was, we've learned some interesting details about this person, who is commonly thought to be a ghost. Apparently, he was a veteran of the American Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1865, and the earliest reports of the Dungarvon Whooper appeared in 1869, so that timeline fits, I guess. He seems to have had connections with Grand Rapids in Michigan. At the beginning of the Civil War, Grand Rapids was basically a frontier town straight out of a Western cowboy movie. It was complete with saloons and bordellos. By the time the war ended, though, the city had grown considerably, and it had become a bustling manufacturing city, focused around a large furniture-making industry. It's possible that this change could have deeply affected a traumatized war veteran who came home to a place he no longer recognized. It's difficult to get much further than that with the information we have, though. The Michigan connection is somewhat less helpful when you realize that there were more than 95,000 men from Michigan who fought in the Civil War, and at least one woman. Michigan was where New Brunswick's Sarah Emma Edmonds enlisted under the alias Frank Thompson. We covered her story in one of our earliest episodes of this podcast as well. We also learned from Frederick Erland's article that we have the Whooper's name, but only sort of. It was apparently something that sometimes sound like Dorns, which isn't super helpful in figuring out the next step in how to decipher who the Whooper really was. I took a quick look through American Civil War records, and it showed that there were about 550 people named Torrance who fought in that war. I'm not even sure why Frederick Erland decided that the closest name to Dorns was Torrance. I mean, it could have been Dorian or Darren or Daryl or Donovan or even Duncan. I mean, it could be a lot of things. So trying to decipher more information from who he was seems like a bit of a needle in a rather expensive haystack. It turns out that you can order up service records of people who fought in the American Civil War whose names sound like Dorns, but it actually costs $80 per request. In US dollars, of course. So I'm not going to start ordering up random people whose name sounds like Dorns. That photo that Frederick Erland took, which shows the logging camp, the group of guides, and even the mystery man that may be the Dungarvon Whooper, can be seen at backyardhistory.ca. All of this just gives us more questions than answers. Where did he come from? Where did he go for 15 years? Why did he return in 1889? And where did he go after? For now, we don't know. But perhaps some reader will send me another interesting thing about the Whooper, and we can figure out more about who he was. As for this meeting, the mysterious stranger left the two reporters as soon as they finished breakfast. Frederick Erland concluded his article by saying,
As he left us, he turned and looked us all over. He did not express a word of thanks or even of interest. He seemed to be all the time in a sort of trance. As he stood looking at us, he seemed to say, Is there any man here who knows me? Or do I know any man here? Then he turned and swung off down the portage at a good gait. Up the bank of the southwest Miramichi River, all alone, barefoot, with his boots in hand, and without means of sustenance. I have often wondered what happened to him. His manner, his incoherent replies, his indifference to the perils of his position indicated that he was not in his right mind. Yet somehow our lost man had worried along through this world for more years than had any of us who pitied him. He was not afraid of the big woods, and perhaps he came out all right. Perhaps he did not. I have presented so much of this story as I know to the readers. Now, what do you suppose became of him?
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.